Hey everyone, Crazy here, and so I've been thinking a little bit about this silly question Augustine Ayala has asked that a few other people have responded to and talked a little about, which is basically what is the strongest card in Hearthstone? And so I'll just jump to the chase, and I'll say that my general argument will be that Call to Arms is the strongest card in Hearthstone. Um, but obviously there's certainly room to debate, so I thought I'd just more explain my reasoning, especially since I don't need to wait to see what the ultimate results are, since obviously I already disagree, since apparently people decided that they thought Dr. Boom was more important than Call to Arms. So I thought I'd just go over kind of the major points here, right? Like a lot of these cards, not a lot of people I think thought would get very far in this discussion, like Keleseth, Arcanologist, Blast Mage, Minibot, Spiteful Summoner. Like no one really thinks these cards are going to be the best. And then nothing here other than really like Lotheb, right? So basically from this bracket, it's Mysterious Challenger, Tarim, or Lotheb. And then if we come down here, we're going to say, basically this is Mad Scientist. Actually, no, this whole thing is just the Ice Block group, right? So we got Ice Block. Then down here we have Ultimate Infestation versus, is there anything else even here? 4-mana 7/7. No, so this is all, actually I'm almost inclined to keep the 4-mana 7/7 in here, because I think there's more discussion to be had there versus even Draconid Operative, which apparently beat it out in the first rung, but I'll go ahead and skip that. So basically, there's about 5 cards from this side that we really would want to think about. Ultimate Infestation, Ice Block, Lotheb, Tarim, and Challenger. And then over here, I'm really baffled by why Emperor Thaurissan got as far as he did. And I know, obviously there are arguments in favor of Thaurissan, but really he's just not really played right now in Wild, basically at all. So it's kind of hard for me to understand why he would be listed as one of the strongest cards ever. But I'll go ahead and leave him in the conversation for now, at least, absolutely. So I guess down here we're basically looking at Gul'dan versus Thaurissan, I guess, which is strange to me, but okay. And then Muster for Battle would be the kind of the third thing to consider here. Reno obviously kind of had his day in the sun, but by today's standards, he's way too slow, which is basically the same argument I would make about Thaurissan, right? And I guess it kind of gets down to what you're asking or what you mean by the strongest card ever. Ever includes right now, and both Reno and Thaurissan basically are unplayable right now. So I find that kind of strange that these would be the ones that really get up there. I'd actually probably say from this group, I would have said Swipe would be, because of these 4 cards, he's really one of the only ones that's still playable. I like playing Kazakus, but I don't think he's the best. Right, then cut Totem Golem. And then Dr. Boom makes it the same way through, and I think, other people have talked about how Dr. Boom, by today's standards, is just not really good enough anymore. And so again, it's kind of strange that Sludge Belcher is actually a lot more playable than Dr. Boom at this point, which is again why I find this kind of strange. Yeah, we can cut a lot of this stuff. I guess Ragnaros kind of made a ways down here, but I also somewhat disagree with that. Tunnel Trog went pretty far, and I think Tunnel Trog versus Call to Arms is kind of an interesting discussion. Certainly Tunnel Trog was really, really strong too. And I think that Crip actually said that this was his pick for the #1 card, and because it just ramps and spirals out of control so quickly. N'Zoth went pretty far here, certainly because he has so much interaction with the Q block, which has really been the point in his entire run where he shone the most was in Q block. And then actually Barnes is pretty impactful too. All these cards are, of course, really, really good. But these are the ones that we kind of come down to. So what is the strength of Mysterious Challenger, right? Put one of each secret from your deck into the battlefield. And so basically what this is draw and play 5 1-cost cards. And so this is a card that was one of the dominant cards and a archetype defining card for years, well past when he rotated out. In Wild, this was one of the archetype defining cards through a lot of the time that Wild has existed as a format, right? So certainly this is a very strong card to consider. Now what's interesting is that if we jump over here, we can see that Mysterious Challenger is still one of the highest win rate cards in the game. And so I think that there is a strong case to be made for Mysterious Challenger as being one of the strongest cards ever printed in Hearthstone. One thing that's interesting to note, though, is that even in Wild, this is kind of a low count, right? Like, if we compare it to Tarim, which is, of course, a card that's still playable in Wild, so more people will have it, 74,000. But this is going to kind of tie into my overall argument here. Is if we look at Call to Arms, we're looking at a 61% win rate, or 62% win rate basically, but 190,000 games played, right? So Call to Arms is being played in 5 times as many decks in Wild right now than Mysterious Challenger. And so obviously a big part of that is because Call to Arms is still in Standard, which means that people who are only interested in Standard haven't dusted it, and people who have only joined the game in the last year or so obviously might not have access to Mysterious Challenger, and that's a large part of the player base. But ultimately, Call to Arms, if we really look at this, right, we have, just in terms of total times played, we have Kobold Librarian, which is also kind of in the, was in the list, and this is certainly interestingly enough, the most played card in Wild, which as a class card is kind of distinctive, right? You might think that a neutral card would be the most played card. But it is Kobold Librarian, because every single Warlock deck plays it, and Warlock is a really popular archetype right now. And we get Doomsayer, Fireball, Righteous Protector, and Shade Idol. And again, like, these are all really strong cards that are going to see play in a lot of decks, but none of them are in and of themselves really kind of archetype defining, which I guess is one of the things that when we think of best card, we kind of think of it as defining an archetype. Wild Growth right up here. Frostbolt, Swipe, again, that's another strong contender. Hellfire, Kingsbane is down here. Then we get things like Arcane Intellect, 3 mana, draw 2 cards in Mage. Still seeing a fair amount of play, even though its played win rate is a little bit low. Then we get down into Knife Juggler, Primordial Glyph, Void Caller, which I think we probably would think about a little bit as well, right? I mean, when we think about some of the cards that Dean mentions, right, like something like Possessed Lackey, Death Rattle, Recruit a Demon, like, I think that it's a harder case to be made for Possessed Lackey because of cards like Void Caller and Wild, where in Wild, Possessed Lackey just isn't quite as significant because there are other options that do something kind of similar. Obviously, the effects are not really the same, but they're close-ish, right, in terms of just getting a minion out earlier than you could otherwise play it. But Call to Arms, unlike those other cards, doesn't really have a really close equivalent in terms of draw 3 and play 3 minions, right? That's really, really significant, that you're not just drawing 2 cards, right, as an Arcane Intellect, but you are drawing and playing 3 cards for just 1 more mana. That is pretty massive, right? If we think of Patches, which kind of defined Pirate Warrior for the time, for its day in the sun. Patches was be drawn from your deck and increase the consistency of your deck by 1 card, right? That's really the main appeal of patches, was activating the pirate synergy so that you could get your combos off a little bit earlier and buffing your weapons, but also increasing the consistency of your deck. And Call to Arms is 2 mana less than Mysterious Challenger, but is drawing and playing 3 cards rather than drawing and playing 5 cards, which is why I think Mysterious Challenger and Call to Arms are 2 of the really strongest contestants for strongest card ever, and both of them are even Paladin cards. Kind of interesting to think about there. If we come back here, there's also Tarim, right? So another really, really strong card is Tarim, who I guess people now believe kind of beats out Mysterious Challenger, which I guess is fair. Tarim does get played more right now in Wild than Mysterious Challenger, partly because of the new archetypes that, Challenger kind of seems too slow. So Tarim versus Call to Arms, I guess, is another kind of interesting conversation to be had. Tarim buffing all the minions and working really well right now with even Paladin and Odd Paladin, and I mean, certainly he really worked well before. But I would still personally say that Call to Arms is more essential than Tarim in a Paladin deck, because you can run 2 Call to Arms and you can only run 1 Tarim, right? And Call to Arms, between the 2 different instances of it in your deck, is going to increase the consistency of your deck if you were to play both by 6 cards, whereas Tarim is going to give you 1 really good field, right? He's going to give you 1 really good board, and you're going to really have to go from there. Lotheb, of course, being like basically the ultimate tempo drop, is certainly worth thinking about here too, and just kind of any aggressive or mid-range deck, Lotheb is going to be really, really strong in protecting your board. But Tarim creates that board and really would be the reaction to Lotheb, which is, I think, why Tarim rightfully beats Lotheb out. So I actually agree with Tarim winning this bracket. When we come down here, Ultimate Infestation versus Ice Block, I personally would have gone with Ultimate Infestation, partly because Ice Block really doesn't see pretty much any play right now, right? Like I mentioned that Reno right now is actually too slow. There are... certainly you can still try to run a Freeze Mage or a Combo Mage in Wild, but people aren't really, right? I mean, it really struggles because the game is just the level of aggression capable of things like Call to Arms, right? Call to Arms is the card that pretty closely makes Ice Block unplayable in Wild, right? Because the aggression and consistency of Paladin decks is so strong, in addition to the Warlock combo decks, that the Ice Block really can't get through, right? And I guess I'm not really including a lot of Warlock cards here other than Gul'dan. If we go back to here and we think about Wild, right? What is defining Warlock, basically, right? Librarian, Hellfire, Voidcaller, Defile, and Possessed Lackey, right? Like, all of these cards are really massively significant in combination with each other. But it's a little bit hard for me to say which one is the most massively important minion on their own, right? Would a Void Lord be so amazing without Possessed Lackey and without Voidcaller to actually get it out of your hand or get it out of your deck? And would Voidcaller or Possessed Lackey be nearly as good without Void Lord to give you the stability of the board after you get the combo off, right? So it's a little bit, it's like chicken or the egg in terms of trying to figure out what makes Q-Block just so amazing. Certainly Naga Sea Witch is still in here, although it's kind of harder to discuss that card because things are... because the card seems like, it got patched to be stronger because of the way it interacted with giants. So while the time it was actually in Standard, it's weaker than it is in Wild now. It's just kind of odd to think about how this card became so massively impactful in Wild, while not really seeing all that much play in Standard when it was printed. So it's just kind of an odd card to think about. It's kind of hard to say that, oh yeah, that's the strongest card ever, when it didn't become strong until of this weird interaction with Giants in the patch. So there is a lot to think to there. But again, if you think about Standard, right? And so we've talked a lot about Wild, but Standard is the archetype that gets, a lot more play, right? 8 million games, 8 million instances of Kobold Librarian played in Standard versus Wild, right? 330,000. It's a pretty massive difference. The most played card right now is Tark Reaper. You get here. This is more what you'd expect, right? A lot of neutral cards that see play in several different archetypes, right? Lots of different decks play these cards, so it's kind of surprising, actually, in Wild that the exception is the case with Kobold Librarian actually seeing more play there. But you get down, and again, this is kind of what we were already talking about, where Q Block has all these different cards that kind of are struggling to be the most important. Whereas if we come down just a little bit more, we get down to Call to Arms here, right? For an Epic, it's been played 3,800,000 times. Its played win rate is 57%, and its deck win rate is 58%. So it's played a lot in Standard, which is really important to think about, right? Like, consider this. Call to Arms is only played in Even Paladin and in non-Baku Paladin, right? One of the two most popular decks right now, well, one of the three most popular decks right now in Paladin, in Standard, is Paladin Baku. And so Call to Arms is only playable in Paladin Gin. So this card is competing with things like Life Drinker, Knife Juggler, all this other stuff, when it's really only played in one class, and not even in every deck of that class, really says a lot about just how important this card is to Even Paladin, and also to an extent to Murloc Paladin. So that really, that in and of itself, that it has been played more than Lost in the Jungle, more than Knife Juggler, more than Life Drinker, more than all the meme Shaman decks, more than Lich King, more than Keleseth, which is one of the cards that's been most popular in a lot of the variations of Spiteful Summoner decks, which is a lot of what you're seeing in Priest and Druid. That Call to Arms is played this much really says that, to me, that this is the definitive card of Even Paladin, and it is really, I think, the definitive card of Paladin, pretty much, right now. Pretty much more so than even Mysterious Challenger, because Call to Arms is played 2 turns earlier than Mysterious Challenger. And the thing is that Paladin still doesn't mind playing 2-drops in the way that sometimes, Mysterious Challenger deck could sometimes struggle a little bit if you drew too many of your secrets too early. And you don't really have that same problem in running 2-drops in a Paladin deck, right? You want to run 2-drops. There's no problem with that. But then you get 3 2-drops on the board. You increase the consistency of your deck by 3 cards. Right? I think this is just the strongest card that has ever been printed in Hearthstone. And so that's kind of why I just wanted to get my 2 cents in here, right? I think that Muster for Battle remains a really strong card. I think that Dr. Boom certainly saw its day in the sun. I think Tunnel Trog was a really strong, aggressive card. I think N'Zoth certainly, in those deck types that could actually get there in Q Block, was massively impactful. But as a 4-mana card that defines Standard right now, and continues to actually define Wild as well, right? Paladin is also the most powerful and popular deck in Wild. I think that Call to Arms has to be the strongest card in Hearthstone. So, that's my argument. Agree or disagree, but be that as it may, thanks for watching, and I'll see you guys later.